they all say. That's right, I'ma do this thing my way. Let's go. Been grinding hard on it all day. It's okay, we work hard, then we all play.
I was just watching Astronauts Gone Wild, and it's quite fascinating to see the responses from some of these individuals to what I believe are just basic questions.
I mean, if I walked on the moon and someone thought it was all done in a TV studio, I would find that hysterically funny. And I would say, sure, I'll swear on a Bible. I will swear on two. Would three make you feel better? But what it's like is walking up to them in front of their wife and saying, oh, your mistress says hello. A sword with no point causes no injury. The fact that they're getting a reaction is because it's truthful. I'm embarrassing them in front of the entourage and exposing their fraud, as many other criminals reacted the same way when they got caught by journalists.
Yeah, there's something very unnatural about their responses to those questions. So yeah, let's jump in if you don't mind, Bart, because it's a fascinating topic. And you believe and been alleging for a long time now that the moon landing didn't actually happen. And I think it's very interesting, and a lot of folks are looking at this kind of idea with a new lens, since all of us have lived through the 2020 COVID campaign, and have been witnessing that for the last 3 years. And I think everybody has had a different experience, or mental model coming out of the whole COVID era, if you will. So has that kind of renewed people's interest in what you've been saying for years, that the moon landing didn't actually happen?
Well, some people said that the way their eyes were opened about the moon landing fraud is because 9/11, Building 7, which surprisingly half Americans, half the people in the military don't even know about. A third 47 tall skyscraper, falling to the ground from a furniture fire. All you have to do is look at the Oklahoma City bombing photograph. Half the building is blown away and the thing still stood. So a pinhole airplane going in and out is not going to cause a steel grid to collapse when blowing half the building away won't cause it to collapse. So 3,000 architects and engineers risked their livelihood and their reputation affirming this is done by explosives. So I think once people saw that the American government was killing 3,000 of their own people, and then Robert McNamara, defense secretary during the Vietnam War, he said that the whole reason that the public was behind it is they were tired. World War II wasn't that long ago, but to get public support, they needed like a Pearl Harbor type of incident, because on December 6, 1941, 90% of Americans were against entering World War II. The following day, after they attacked us, 90% were for it. So he and his friends at the CIA said, we need some Pearl Harbor thing to get support for this war. And so they invented the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was allegedly a North Vietnamese ship attacking an American ship. He said on his deathbed, that never happened. Me and the CIA, we made that up. Well, that led to the death of 3 million people, including 58,220 of their own Americans, right? And then Robert Kennedy Jr., who has more access to the JFK files than Oliver Stone does, he says that the CIA murdered President Kennedy. So I believe him. So if they're willing to kill their own president, they're willing to kill 58,220 Americans needlessly, they're willing to kill 3,000 on 9/11, I think they're willing to fake an image on the moon. The interesting thing, though, Michael, is that regardless of who shot JFK, he's still dead. Whoever did 9/11, those people are dead. This is a different lie. This is a positive lie. This is Santa Claus for adults. They want to believe in Santa Claus. They want to believe in the glory of America and science. And to take that candy away and to give them a turd in its place is difficult for people. Telling who shot Kennedy is just changing one turd to another turd. You know what I mean? He's still dead. And so, but this is different. When I showed this footage that I show, and a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, which people can see for free at Sibrel.com. A millionaire who builds rockets for NASA, who knows the moon missions are fake, gave me $1 million to produce these movies. And we uncovered this classified footage of fake photography of them faking being halfway to the moon right in front of your eyes. And yet, there are people, including a college professor at Aerospace University, who says even if he saw Neil Armstrong himself confess on national TV, he would still think he walked on the moon anyway. I mean, come on. So I showed this footage we uncovered of a 1-foot model of the Earth being simulated to be the Earth floating in space, as if they're looking back at the Earth halfway to the moon, dated 2 days into the flight. The same shot appears in every NASA documentary as allegedly the Earth floating in space. We have the unedited version that says, do not show to the public at the beginning of it. The lights come up and it's a 1-foot model of the Earth. And we have a third track of audio of the CIA prompting them to fake a 4-second radio delay to pretend they're further away from the Earth. I showed this to 2 NBC News directors. The first one said, this absolutely proves they did not go to the moon. And he refused to broadcast it for fear it would cause a civil war. He says, this is really going to upset the public. You see, it's that Santa Claus. I remember, Michael, when I was 6 years old, I was going to a private school because so I could start school a year early. I think I actually was 5. And some, teenager, junior high, were spoiling Santa Claus for all the kids. They thought it was funny, telling all the little kids there is no Santa Claus. So I go home and I kind of pressure my parents. And it was just like ever seen All in the Family, her chair on the left, my dad's chair on the right, TV in the middle. And I go, they're watching TV and I'm like, Mom, is there really a Santa Claus? I mean, really? Come on, really? I remember saying it like that. Oh yeah, there's Santa Claus. Let us watch TV. Go to my dad. Dad, really? Really? He said, yeah. And I went back and forth so much, I irritated them. Finally, my dad said, okay, there's no Santa Claus. When you're asleep, we get the presents out of the closet, put them in and I just cried and cried and I cried all night. And, they held ticker tape parades for these guys. They gave them medals of honor for being such good liars. People prayed for them. They waved their flags. And to find out that's all a lie, maybe the guy was right. 10 years later, another news director at NBC, national news, says we're going to broadcast this nationwide and prove the moon landings are fake. They flew me to New York, put me up in the Waldorf Astoria, gave me thousands of dollars for the exclusive license, and then they got a call from the federal government threatening them, and they backed down. This has been very embarrassing, not only on the world stage, but also to Americans, infuriating them at the sheer arrogance of the federal government. And may have killed fewer people than 9/11 or even the Kennedy assassination witness list. But it's different. It's a sweet lie that they're being told was a complete fabrication, really for no reason. They should have just said, we set a goal we can't do. But they were juvenile. The people who run our government are juvenile, and they couldn't tell the truth. They made up a story, and then there's a list of homicides to cover it up. Not my opinion, the opinion of the dead man's relatives told me so. So this is our country. It's sad. You seem like a professional, and you're implying, and I'll be careful what I say in case you want to upload this to certain venues, but you seem to be awake about the thing that's been going on for the last 3 years, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's been eye-opening for a lot of people.
Yeah, and it just boggles the mind. I remember, Michael, I'm a hotshot 20s filmmaker in Nashville, Tennessee. I go to see a movie, at noon on a Tuesday, because I work like 2 days a week, and it's The Truman Show. And I'm like, this is dumb. This is dumb. I walk out of it. Now I watch it once a year and cry every time I see it. When Christ, pushes him to overcome, his fear of water and drowning. And it was to his blood. If someone wrote a script, I'm a filmmaker, hopefully producing my first feature film soon, And if someone wrote a script where the government kills their own president, fakes moon landings, fakes beginning of wars, fakes illnesses, fakes medicine, I was like, this is just not realistic. This is like 1984 on steroids. No, no. And here we are. I mean, when I popped in that tape and it dawned on me they really did fake the moon landing, I was just crushed, not as an American, as a human, that this is humanity. We're so depraved, immature, dishonest. We lie about the greatest accomplishment of mankind by the alleged most righteous nation on earth. And I'm like, wow, how sad is that?
Yeah, so July 20th, 1969, if I got it right. I wasn't born yet, but the whole world was watching the United States, land on the moon. And there's all this, there's not all this footage. There's footage that they continue to repeat, images. So how did you fall into this or discover that maybe something's not right here and then start your investigation?
Well, I grew up believing they were real like everybody else, and even more so. My dad was in the Air Force, and he got a VIP package as an officer of these 9 by 12 color prints of Apollo 11. I was 4 years old, asleep in bed, and a few weeks later, I get these pictures. It's my most cherished possession. I put them on my bedroom wall. We moved every 2 years, and every place I lived, there was a place of honor in my bedroom where side by side these 15 or so pictures would be for the glorious time man first set foot upon the moon. So from the age of 4 to 14, I thought not only that it was real, that it was glorious. And I mean, a shrine everywhere I went to it. And then I see a gentleman who worked for NASA, high security clearance, who said it just didn't happen. It couldn't happen. It can't happen today, 50 years later. With 50 years better technology, they're sending mannequins to orbit the moon because humans can't do it. So how could they do it on the first attempt with 1 millionth the computing power cell phone? And so I'm like, oh, I'm an open-minded 14-year-old. And I'm like, oh, I never thought about that. The missions are fake. So I go back to my bedroom wall, and these early prints have more mistakes in them than the color corrected ones, which they put out now. The soil in the original pictures is depicted as the soil color actually is. It's caramel brown. The Chinese probes, caramel brown soil. But in the NASA pictures after the first 6 months, it's grayish blue to match the grayish blue background. So in the originals, where you have the brown real soil and the gray blue background, you can see horizontally left to right pretty clear where the real soil ends and the fake backdrop begins. And I'm like, oh, never thought of that. So fast forward another 10 years, by the age I'm 24, I'm a filmmaker, and a filmmaker's job is to make fake scenes look real. So I looking at the pictures, and I can tell for certainty that they're electrical lighting, even what kind of lighting, because I have the same kind in my closet with my camera equipment. And I'm editing one day for the guy who produced the show that I'd seen as a 14-year-old. And I said, do you remember that guy on your show who said we didn't go to the moon? I'd like to talk to him. So he puts me in touch with him, and he suggests as a filmmaker that I do a film about the moon landings being fake. And I think about it and study it pretty intently for about 6 months. We have shadows intersecting at 90 degrees from objects 5 feet apart when they should be parallel in sunlight. That's electrical lighting, which means they're on Earth. I mean, you can scientifically prove it in a court of law that the moon missions are fake with one picture. And go to Sibrel.com, go to Moonman video links, and click on the first link, and you'll see it. And there's so much proof we didn't go. And as I start seeing this evidence, I'm like, this is kind of spooky. Maybe they really did fake it. And I realized if they did fake it, and I have kind of, as you can tell from Astronauts Gone Wild, kind of a relentless, never give up personality. That, combined with liking puzzles always, I thought, well, if anyone could uncover the truth, it would be me. And then I thought, well, if they didn't go, I could be bothering the CIA, that might not be good for my health. So I turned it down. And I said, I want to have a wife and family someday. I'm not going to risk my life for what Nixon did. No, thank you. And then another client, famous Christian musician, I was editing a video for them, and they said they'd get a script of mine to a famous Hollywood producer if I did them a favor. I'm like, oh, what favor? Read the Bible. So I got a 1-year Bible, dividing it into 365 daily reads, January 1st, March 2nd, and so forth. And over the next 5 years, I read it 5 times from cover to cover. It didn't make me a Christian, but I did understand there is good and evil, and there's truth and lies. And if they faked the moon landing, that's actually more profound historically than if they actually gone. Do you see that? I mean, the two choices: they went up, planted a flag on a rock, came back, okay, or they lied to the whole world, they lied to their citizens, they lied to the encyclopedia. That's more profound historically if that's true. And I realized this is important because we can't go forward as a species until we admit our mistakes. And if they're covering this up, we'll be stuck here. It's like stuck in the minor leagues when you want to go on to the major league. And we have to acknowledge this mistake, faking the moon landing. And I said, look, I'm going to die anyway, and I might as well die for a just cause. So I changed my mind. Called back up the guy who worked at NASA, said I changed my mind. As serendipity would have it, days later, I meet a millionaire who builds rockets for NASA, who knows the moon missions are fake, who gave me $1 million to produce these movies. And the first film took 7 years to produce, mostly research, just to edit the movie, which is, I think, about 45 minutes long. I spent up to 4,000 hours. That's 40 hours a week for 2 years just to edit the movie. And
What's the name of that
years,
one?
That's a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, which you can see for free at Sibrel.com. And halfway into that film, I'm trying to find the launch in real time from like T plus a minute or down, minus a minute to plus a minute. And it's even that's edited. It jumps from 60 seconds to 30 seconds to 5 seconds. And so I go through the last of the NASA tapes. I figured if they faked the moon landing, they're more likely to have made a mistake the first time they faked it because they never faked it before. So I tell NASA I'm doing a documentary about the moon landings, which is true. I'm not about to tell them, hey, I'm trying to prove it's fake. Send me some good, good stuff. So I say I want everything from just the first mission, every still picture, every video, every film. And it's like the same. I got 20 tapes, but it's the same thing over and over again. It's like there's very little footage. In fact, of astronauts standing on the surface of the moon, still photography, there's probably only 15 pictures from the first mission, and 0 of Neil Armstrong, believe it or not. He didn't want to have his picture taken. So I'm going through these last tapes to try to find the countdown, and I pop in a tape and it says, do not show to the public. And I'm like, oh, this should be good. So I hit fast forward. It's going 20 times normal speed, but I've edited for thousands of hours. I can kind of tell what it is. And I see like a little blue ball Earth surrounded by black, and it's supposed to be the Earth floating in space. And I'm like, and it's going on for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I'm like, oh, this is the same thing. This is unedited footage. I asked for that, but didn't get any. And then I realized what was on the label of the tape and what the content was were 2 completely different things. Either they made a clerical error and no reporter had been as thorough as I was before, which is likely, or, as my source at NASA thinks, one of his friends sent it to me to expose it. And so I'm like, well, let me rewind this, watching in real time. I hit play from the top. You see the little blue Earth allegedly floating in space, and you hear NASA say, hey, the TV picture looks great. Then there's exactly 4 seconds of dead air. Then you hear a third party, not the astronauts, not NASA, say, talk. And then Neil Armstrong starts speaking.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger, we're mapping in on Earth.
So the CIA gave him an earpiece. They counted off 4 seconds. They said talk, and then he answered. And then we see what he claims is 130,000 miles out. and the lights come up, and it's a mock-up, a 1-foot diameter mock-up of the Earth. I'm like, oh my gosh, they really did fake the moon landing. And I call up, my source at NASA, panicked, they really didn't go. They really didn't go. And he's like, well, Bart, I told you. I'm like, no, they really did fake it. He's like, well, Bart, I told you. I mean, I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt for as long as possible. I mean, Santa Claus is much more fun to believe in than your parents, are tricking you. And when you realize we live in such a sad world with such a sad government, but it's still better to know. It's still better to know. I mean, you could go to a restaurant for 10 years, you think it's the best, in the world, and you find out they've been poisoning you every time you've eaten there for 10 years. You could pretend like they're not, ignore it that they're not poisoning you and keep eating there, and you would lose that joy. Or would you rather know the truth, as sad as it might be? And my chapter of my book, which just came out at Sibrel.com, it's an audio that I read or Kindle or print. I put a quote from people at the beginning or end of each chapter. And I believe the first one in there is actually a quote from Men in Black 3, which oddly enough has a scene of the Apollo launch in it. And it says, the bitterest truth is better than the sweetest lie. And that's really the case. So we basically have a problem with our government. So when Orwell says whoever controls the past controls the future, this is a perfect example of that. Because the criminals are saying about the past that the moon missions are real when they certainly were not. And unless it's exposed, the same criminals will control our future. Which means unless the truth comes out about the moon landing fraud, we will never have honest government in the United States ever again.
So the footage of them faking the 130,000 miles out when they did that broadcast, you actually have footage that's not supposed to be released to the public, and you got that
correct.
from
and that's
okay.
That's showcased in the film. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. There were a lot of evidence indicating the moon missions were staged. And I said, well, not conclusive enough. And then when I see them faking being halfway to the moon, dated 2 days into the flight by NASA's own computer, and the lights come up and it's a 1-foot model of the Earth that's pretending to be floating in space. I'm like, oh my gosh, they're faking being halfway to the moon, which means they could not go halfway, which means they didn't go.
During this segment, intended to be edited and played back later for the worldwide television audience, dated July 18th, 1969, Neil Armstrong condemns himself as he states that he is 130,000 miles out, or halfway to the moon, as the NASA flight log also states on this date, when he is in reality in low Earth orbit of a few hundred miles.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Here, during another segment, also intended to air after review, Neil Armstrong falsely explains to the viewers how the shot is attained by putting the camera's lens to the window's glass, as it would have to be if they were the claimed distance away from the Earth.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with a TV camera.
If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the Terminator or inside the shadow.
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
Blue cast, see white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth.
This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window.
And here we are 54 years later, and they still cannot leave Earth orbit. That's why there's mannequins orbiting the moon. I mean, what they're really claiming, and really the first proof that we didn't go to the moon, is today, with 50 years better technology, the farthest that NASA can send an astronaut into space is 1,000th the distance to the moon. So what they're claiming is, in 1969, when all of NASA's computing power combined had 1/1,000,000th the computing power of a cell phone, they sent astronauts 1,000 times farther into space than they can send them today with 50 years better technology, which means they're claiming that they had greater technology in the past than in the future. But that's a historic and scientific impossibility. There's never been an instance where technology was greater in the past and in the future in the entire history of man. There's never been a scientific milestone like flying across the Atlantic, the first atomic bomb, the first breaking of the sound barrier, that wasn't super surpassed 10 years later and no one could repeat 50 years later. Just 10 years after the first atomic bombs were 1,000 times more powerful. So if we could go to the moon on the first attempt with 1960s technology, we would have been on Mars 10 years later in another solar system by now, and we bases all over the moon. We can't drive cars and play golf on the moon, in 1969, and somehow today we can't even land, and we can only send mannequins around the moon. It doesn't make any sense. My book, Moon Man, the true story of a filmmaker on the CIA hit list, called that because I found a recording of an Apollo astronaut and his son discussing my assassination by the CIA, which would certainly not be necessary if they really went to the moon, and I'm some silly person who thinks it was done on Earth. The book is interactive, 16 video clips to back up everything I'm saying in the book. And basically, I write a chapter, then I say go to Sibrel.com, watch a video link 1, another chapter, video link 2. One of the links is NASA's own astronaut, Don Pettit, saying that they intentionally destroyed all of the technology that in today's dollars cost $200 billion to go to the moon. Now, if there was ever a technology you were going to destroy, it would probably be the atomic bomb, right? Okay, we used it to end World War II. Let's not use it again. Let's destroy everything. Maybe they had that as an option. Why would Bill Gates spend $200 billion building the first supercomputer and then throw it all in a furnace, the hardware, the schematics, and everything else? They're saying they destroyed a $200 billion investment intentionally. They destroyed all the hardware. They destroyed the electrical diagrams, the schematics, the telemetry as to where the rocket really was. They destroyed that. And every single original videotape of the original recordings of going to the moon, they intentionally destroyed that as well. You would never do that if you really went to the moon, and that's exactly what you would do if you perpetrated a fraud. So the fact that they destroyed everything is actually evidence of the fraud.
Yeah. So what other evidence are you claiming to support the argument that the whole thing was a fraud? I know you mentioned shadows. Can you talk about that a little bit more? These are shadows from which images?
Well, there's basically 4 proofs, and each proof by itself would prove the moon landings are fake, meaning we have 4 times the necessary proof. The first is you can't travel 1,000 times farther into space in 1969 than you can today. It can't happen. You cannot have 1,000 times greater space traveling technology in 1969 than today. That's their claim. That proves it was a falsehood, a bluff and poker. Secondly, go to Sibrel.com, click on link number 1. You'll see shadows intersecting at 90 degrees from objects 5 feet apart. Go outside in sunlight. We show a side-by-side comparison. Look at 2 trees, 2 telephone poles, 2 people in your front yard or company parking lot. The shadows always run parallel and never intersect. If they're intersecting at 90 degrees and they claim it's sunlight, that is not possible. It cannot be duplicated in sunlight. It can only be duplicated when an electrical light is so close. If you stand to the left of it, the shadow goes in one direction, and if you stand to the right of it, it goes in another direction. That would prove it in a court of law. So that's the third proof. And then we have the classified footage of fake photography. Even NBC, two NBC news directors agreed it proved they didn't go to the moon. Even my critics agree that it is them faking being halfway to the moon. That proves it. And then we have the deathbed confession of Cyrus Eugene Akers, who was the chief of security at Cannon Air Force Base. Now, a court considers not only eyewitness testimony enough to put someone away. If you eyewitness someone kill somebody, when it's a deathbed confession, they consider it twice as powerful. The guy's dying. He wants to get right with God and not go to hell. The first thing he confesses to is he's a murderer. He killed somebody personally. He killed a coworker at Cannon Air Force Base. And the reason, he said, is because him and his friend eyewitnessed the fake filming of the moon landing June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1968. His friend thought it was morally wrong. He was going to tell a reporter, and either of his own initiative or he was assigned to do it, he killed him to cover it up. You don't confess you're a murderer as you're dying unless it's true. And if he says the reason was to cover up the moon landing fraud, you better believe it. And as the chief of security on day one of the filming, he stood beside President Johnson, who gave him a list of 15 VIP people who were allowed in to eyewitness it. We published that list in the book. 2 of those people have been verified to have been at Cannon Air Force Base at that time. So, and it's the special ops. Every military division, Marines, Army, Air Force, they have their special ops intelligence division. And guess where the headquarters of that is? Of the Air Force, Cannon Air Force Base. And this is more than enough proof. The only reason people wouldn't accept it is they just can't accept it. Like that college professor who said, even if he saw one of the astronauts confess that the moon missions were fake, he'd still think he went anyway. I don't know what to say about such people. These are the sad facts. This is the world. This is our government. And who would think that the most outrageous conspiracy theory, the moon landings were shot on Earth, ends up being absolutely true?
Yeah, what's the government's, what do you think at least is the government's motive for faking the moon landing?
Well, I guess Kennedy, who's not a scientist, he's a politician. He was a visionary, and they went into outer space for a whopping 15 minutes, didn't even do an orbit around the Earth. And he says, hey, a few days later, let's set a goal to go to the moon before the decade is out. He used an Irish parable about one brother challenging another brother to climb over this tall wall, and to make him do it, he took his brother's hat and threw it over the wall. And he said, by making this public goal, we are forcing ourselves to achieve it. When it later proved to be an impossibility, they refused to eat humble pie and admit they had bitten off more than they can chew, and they falsified it like a bluff in poker. And so that was the first reason, pride. And then there was a threat to America in Nixon's mind. The greatest threat was people protesting the federal government over the involvement of the Vietnam War, which, as we know from Robert McNamara's deathbed confession, was contrived also. And so what better way to take people's minds off the negativity going on in America than give them something to cheer about? President Johnson came up with the official code name called Codename Slam Dunk, because slam dunk meant a guarantee. And if you faked going to the moon, you could guarantee its success. So they gave the American people what they wanted, something to believe in, something positive. That was the reason. And then they embezzled a huge amount of money. If it cost $200 billion in today's dollars, and they only went into Earth orbit, which they had already done, then they probably only spent about 25% of that money, which means they had an extra $150 billion to do whatever they wanted to do, go into Cambodia, go into Laos, with military equipment. I don't know. So there are multiple reasons. And then these same people or their apprentices are the same ones who killed Kennedy and faked the Gulf of Tonkin. And so they have this criminal behavior that's pre-established, this criminal arrogance to take advantage of the taxpayers. That's part of it too. They've just gotten in the habit of lying and deceiving the American people. And this country was founded not by the Constitution, but by the Declaration of Independence, which said when any government becomes destructive of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Well, I interviewed the widow of the Apollo 1 crew, director, commander, and I interviewed her for 4 hours. And she said on January 26, 1967, her husband came home from work and said, "Hon, for some strange reason, the CIA is all over the launch pad monkeying around with equipment. I wonder why. Never seen him here before." The next day, the guy is dead from, quote, faulty equipment. He was a whistleblower. He held an impromptu press conference a few days before saying that they were a decade away from going to the moon, not 2 years, that all the equipment was junk. He was preparing congressional reports to say so through his senator, and they got rid of him. Not my opinion, opinion of the dead man's widow and the dead man's son, who's a 747 pilot. So they are destructive of life, because who killed those people? CIA agents. Who paid their salaries? The taxpayers. Who paid for the hardware to kill them? The taxpayers. So we're funding not only our own deception, we're funding the murder of our brothers and sisters who are trying to expose their crime. So the government has become destructive of life. Liberty. In California, if you have more than 5 people at a birthday party when they tell you not to, they will throw you in jail and turn off your electricity. Okay, so if I have to ask permission to have, so many people in my own home, if I have to ask permission to leave my home, if I have to have permission to open my business, I have to ask permission to go to church, that's slavery. That's what slaves do. We're being told we're the most free and we're the most enslaved. Just like we're told we have the best health care in the world when it's the worst. I can prove it. If you remove cancer and heart disease, the #1 cause of death in America, it's a known fact, is medical malpractice. Kills up to 1 million people a year. 70% of Americans are taking prescription medicine. Okay, that means 70% of Americans are sick all the time. If I told you there's a country in the world where 70% of the population is sick all the time, that country has the worst health care in the world, not the best. So we're being told we're free when we're slaves. We're being told lie after lie after lie by the federal government. It boggles the mind, their arrogance. And then Woodward and Bernstein, who broke Watergate, found a CIA document in 1975 that at that time, back when you could only own one radio station and one TV station and one newspaper, and those laws have been thrown away, they said they had 400 journalists working on the CIA payroll at NBC, ABC, CBS, Reuters, Associated Press, Time, Life, Newsweek, everything, completely covered. One of the clips at Moonman at Sibrel.com is Dan Rather, 2 days after Kennedy was shot, describing for the public the Zapruder film that they refused to show. And he says after the third fatal shot, you can see Kennedy's head go violently forward. When you synchronize it with the Zapruder film, his head is going violently backwards. He's saying the exact opposite of the truth on national TV. So you have to ask yourself, who would say the exact opposite of the truth of the forensic evidence about who killed Kennedy? Well, the perpetrator would. And who is powerful enough to control CBS Evening News? Well, the federal government is. That means the perpetrator is the federal government. The evidence is right there. And so what is to be done about this? I don't know. I don't know that anything can be done. I think it's like a Nazi machine. You can have 12 generals against Hitler, and it still was not enough to bring the guy down. that's what we're stuck with, it looks like.
Yeah, there's been so many inconsistencies over the last 3 years. I think a lot of Americans have witnessed directly just with COVID and a lot of other things. And it's one thing to learn about the past, like 1969, but it's another thing to actually live through one of the campaigns and to see all the inconsistencies that are out there. So I think that's been waking up a lot of folks just to get some sort of little instinct of saying, all right, something's a little bit off here. Something's wrong here. What they're saying is not actually what I'm seeing on the ground. We're not seeing dead bodies with COVID every step we take on the sidewalk. There's no hazardous material deposit boxes, all over the corners of the streets in order to put your mask in. And things of that nature. So there are a lot of inconsistencies. I think people have finally started to see those things. They may not understand what they're witnessing yet, but I think one fraud or one scam or one campaign, whatever you want to call it, after the other, starts to wake up most people.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting observation you made. My wife was the care provider of the first illness death, allegedly, in the state of Tennessee. And she said he didn't die of that illness. He was already on his deathbed because of cancer. They stamped that illness on him. And then then the guy who invented the test that shows allegedly whether you have the illness or not, he said it gets a false positive 95% of the time if you use it that way. It's a misuse of it. And so this hospital, get this, it's reported on the local news, 450 employees of the hospital have this illness. 450. Did they put tape around it? Did they put a big tent over the building? No, people just walking in and out. And everyone's required to wear face coverings except the administrator. He just walks around somehow in the know about what's really going on. And then this medicine that has never been used on humans before, a medicine that you're taking for an illness you don't even have. Imagine getting chemotherapy to prevent cancer. Is that a wise thing to do? And I'm watching on national news, and they say pregnant women need to go out and get this medicine. And I'm like, what? And I thought I was dreaming, Michael. I literally thought I was dreaming. I'm like, the world cannot be this wicked. It cannot be this wicked. It cannot be this wicked. I must be dreaming. But it is. And Walter Cronkite was the lead of CBS News, but he couldn't bring himself to say the third fatal shot made his head go violently forward when it went backward. He couldn't even bring himself to say it. He had Dan Rather say it, who looked down instead of at the camera when he said it. And CBS Evening News, last time I watched, was hosted by a female anchor. But she took that day off when they said pregnant women need to go out and get this medicine for an illness they don't have. She didn't have the guts to say it. There was a film, I'm a filmmaker, and sometimes I see analogies in films. There's a film, Field of Dreams. I don't know if you saw that years ago, beautiful movie. And there's the Burt Lancaster character as the old man. And he's sitting with Kevin Costner in that little small town bar. And he says, most people don't realize the most significant moments of their life while they're living them. I thought there would be other times, and I realize now that was the only time. And what we're seeing is amazing censorship that we somehow think is normal, that anything that's contrary to the government CIA point of view is removed from the internet. If they can take it down, they will. Do not people not realize how significant and scary that is? That's nowhere near free speech. And then people's PayPal accounts, that's banking, is being shut down for their political views or views about medicine. That's highly illegal, right? And by the way, YouTube and Google and all those things, they're utilities. And according to federal law, you can't shut off someone's electricity for criticizing the electric company, right? We have no discrimination based on race, color, or creed. What is creed? It's a belief. My ad revenue was shut off on YouTube the day after I came to the defense of someone whose ad revenue was shut off. Their excuse was my films that I had been making thousands of dollars from, and they were making more. I think they take 55% and give you 45, or the other way around, but they're making as much money as I am, and they turned off their own income. They said that my films suddenly aren't ad worthy anymore. And I'm like, well, Nissan Cars was my main sponsor. Nissan doesn't care if you're Republican or Democrat, believe the moon landings are real or fake. They just want you to buy the car. So what difference does it make? And then it's like they're shutting down people's channels because there's duplicates of their video. Well, that just means twice as many ways for them to make ad revenue. It makes no sense that they would do this. Why would they be destroying their own stream of income unless income is not their purpose and information control is? YouTube was only around for 1.5 years before it was bought out and taken over by Google, and it's a fact in the federal record, was founded by DARPA, or government money, to control information. So what can you do? People don't realize what a scary moment in history we're living right now.
I think folks, just to say, I think folks are desensitized quite a bit as to how egregious it is to kick a sitting president, whoever it is, off the internet, off social media sites simultaneously, in a colluded effort.
Or
that's
cut off live what he's saying because they disagree with him. It's the same thing, and to call it a problem is too mild of a word. It's shocking. It's dangerous, is what it is. It's alarming. It's historical.
Yeah,
it's unprecedented,
it really is.
In America. Never happened before in the history of America.
Yeah,
that people bank accounts were shut down because of their political beliefs, and it's like it's normal. It's like just normal behavior.
Everyone's been desensitized. So let's talk a little bit, going back to the alleged moon landing. Let's put in perspective how far the moon is from planet Earth, and how come we do see footage from astronauts in space. So they're floating, they show off how their pens are floating around and all the other things within the space shuttle and the International Space Station. So where are these things in relation to each other in orbit?
Well, I mean, the moon is approximately, on average, 239,000 miles away. Earth orbit, where the space station is only 250 miles. So the moon is 1,000 times farther. So that's the significance. All manned space missions have been in Earth orbit, except going to the moon. Now, most people don't know this, right? But at 1,000 miles up above the Earth and extending 30,000 miles more approximately is a field of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belt. The only time in history humans are said to have gone through it is to the moon and back. One of the free clips you can see at Sibrel.com is NASA's own engineer, Kelly Smith, saying it's a dangerous, meaning deadly, field of radiation, and, quote, the technology necessary to survive a trip through it to the moon and back has yet to be invented. So all of these manned space missions are orbital, 700 miles or more below the beginning of the radiation. That is so intense, if you close your eyes from 700 miles away, you can see it as sparks of light hitting the retinas of your closed eye. Imagine there's a nuclear meltdown 700 miles away. At night, you close your eyes when you face that direction and you see the radiation hitting the retinas of your closed eyes. That's pretty strong radiation. And so NASA admits that the technology to survive a trip through it has yet to be invented. This is why there's mannequins orbiting the moon now, because humans cannot go through the radiation and survive at this moment in technological development. You get the zero gravity effect, the pin or tuna sandwich floating by, in Earth orbit, because you're doing a combination of orbiting and falling and going forward and falling at the same time. I've gotten many emails from people who know gravity better than I do, and they say on a trip to the moon, you would have gravity. And yet, in all of these Apollo shots, they say they're on their way to the moon, things are floating by. That proves they're in Earth orbit, because once you go in a straight line to the moon, you're going to have gravity, and things will not float anymore. He pointed that out. How about that one? So, any clip where they say they're going to the moon, coming back from the moon, or going to the moon, and things are floating by, that proves they're in Earth orbit. We have footage where the lights come up and you see the big Earth outside of the window when they claim to be halfway to the moon. So you can orbit the Earth, but you cannot leave Earth orbit. The technology doesn't exist. So we have them faking being halfway to the moon, which means they cannot go halfway. They can't leave Earth orbit then, and they can't leave Earth orbit now. Otherwise, there'd be humans orbiting the moon instead of mannequins. So this is what we're stuck with. It becomes more and more apparent as the time goes on that they did not go to the moon. And some people, like that professor, just don't want to admit it. Children don't want to know that there's no Santa Claus. They'd rather believe in the moon landing and believe in Santa Claus.
Yeah, so the moon is over 200,000 miles away. The International Space Station is about 250 miles away. So when we see footage of these astronauts floating around in the International Space Station, that's only 250 miles away. So, and that's
Correct.
considered Earth
It's
orbit,
not far at all. I mean,
okay.
just pick a city that's 250 miles from you, or 350 kilometers, make it vertical, and that's as far as they go into space today with 50 years better technology. They're stuck there, because they go any higher, they start experiencing severe radiation, and if they left Earth orbit, they would have to go through the radiation field. I mean, Elon Musk just said, in order to put humans on the moon, they're going to have to make 9 fuel trips to a space station halfway between the Earth and the moon. Von Braun said you'd have to make about 17 fuel trips in Earth orbit. In any case, they're saying they have to make 9 fuel trips to get enough fuel to leave Earth orbit and go to the moon. So how did they do it in one trip in 1969? You see, if technology is getting better, you would need less fuel and less effort to go to the moon today than you would in 1969, but they're actually saying it's going to take more effort than it did back then.
So has Elon Musk specifically ever discussed the moon landing itself, the 1969 moon landing? Has he ever commented on whether it happened or didn't happen directly?
No, he said a couple of interesting things. First of all, I know space shuttle astronauts who know that the moon missions are fake, but they want to go into outer space and go into Earth orbit, and they keep their mouth shut. Otherwise, they won't have that opportunity. Elon Musk wants to fulfill his goals of rocketry, and he needs NASA's cooperation in order to do that. So he's keeping his mouth shut. I know somebody who works in the Chinese Space Center, in the command center. He says everybody there knows the moon missions are fake, and they're actually blackmailing the United States government. They're getting space technology from NASA under the table, which violates the Espionage Act, and in exchange for keeping their mouth shut from exposing the moon landing fraud. Another good reason for the truth to come out, so that we won't be blackmailed anymore. The closest thing that Elon Musk came to saying it was that the moon landing capability of 1969 is a technological anomaly. Take that for what it is.
Yeah, it's hard to believe, just in any context, that now in this year that we're in, we don't have the same technology as 1969. And whatever the discussion or topic is, I mean, the technology has advanced year after year, in almost everything. But for the government or anyone to say that we only had a certain technology in 1969 that allowed us to accomplish something so substantial, but yet 54 years later, we do not have that capability anymore, it just goes against logic.
Well, yeah, and they did it on the first attempt, and they did it with 1/1,000th the computing power of a cell phone. Elon Musk wanted to land a rocket vertically, so he put 6 rockets around the rocket to gimbal it straight to try to get it to land vertically to save hardware and use it again. And so he had 6 computers 100 million times more powerful than all of NASA had when they went to the moon, allegedly. So he had 600 million times the computing power of the Apollo rocket lunar lander. And when he tried to land it vertically with 600 million times the computing power, 6 computers, not one, like the LM had, the first time it blew up, the second time it blew up, the third time it blew up, the fourth time it blew up, and he got it the 5th time. So how is it that they landed vertically 6 times 50 years ago with 1/600 millionth the computing power and 1 computer instead of 6? I guess that's the technological anomaly he's talking about. All this advancement in equipment, and it works worse than the lunar module did in 1969. That looks like the thing is made out of paper mache and cardboard when you look at it. And yeah, it's a big inconsistency in the technological development of mankind. You can't, and then look at this. No aerospace endeavor, not in the entire history of the world, ever completed a successful flight the first time. Not a single time. Not the Wright brothers kite plane, and not the 747. The 747 was built with 10 years better technology than the Apollo program, after millions and millions and millions of aircraft were built over the last 50, 75 years. Not like the first spacecraft to leave Earth orbit. Millions of aircraft have been built. And just to get that fuselage off the ground took 168 attempts. You see, the only aerospace machine that ever completed successful first flight was the most complicated one of all time. And NASA has never kept a schedule, not a single time. They said in 2014, they're going to have people orbiting the moon. In 2018, double the time, and they only have mannequins orbiting. They said they were going to put the Hubble Space Telescope in orbit, Earth orbit. In 10 years, it took 20 years. The only time NASA has ever kept a schedule was the most complicated, untried mission of all time, in which they were ahead of schedule. How about that? So that's like 3 technological inconsistencies with it. I mean, and there's just many, many more. And this is, of course, why they destroyed the diagrams and the schematics and the blueprints and the hardware, because someone could prove that it doesn't have enough fuel to leave Earth orbit. I have a video I just posted on my YouTube channel, Von Braun, the rocket designer, saying out of his own mouth, you cannot go to the moon directly. You have to build a space station first, which wasn't finished until I think 2001. And then from there, you have to make multiple fuel trips and there go to the moon. He said to go to the moon in 1 rocket, we have it in writing, it would take 3 rockets, each taller than the Empire State Building, each weighing 10 times the tonnage of the Queen Mary, or 800,000 tons. The Saturn V rocket weighed 2,500 tons. It's a difference of 30,000%. He says these mathematical numbers are irrefutable. 2 + 2 = 4, end of story. This is the way it has to be done. Can't be done any other way. And he says it's impossible to build a rocket that big, so you're going to have to make multiple fuel trips. They never did it that way. What can you say?
So what are the biggest counter arguments that you receive from critics? So you're saying that there's indisputable proof. There's the shadows in the images that are not right. The footage of the astronauts it was supposedly floating around on the moon. There's all sorts of different inconsistencies there that especially in your first film, which is the a funny thing happened on the way to the moon. So what are the biggest counter arguments that you're receiving from people who are actually putting thought into everything you provide in terms of evidence?
Well, the first one that I always hear is that the government wouldn't lie about such an important thing. Remember, they killed their own president, according to his own relatives. They faked the beginning of the Vietnam War, which led to the death of 58,220 Americans, according to the defense secretary at the time. So I think if they did that, they're willing to fake an image on a television, you see? And there's no independent press coverage. I mean, World War II was done in front of billions of eyewitnesses. This has no independent press coverage. We just have to trust that these images are coming from the moon. And then people say, well, you couldn't keep a secret from the 200,000 people involved in the space program. Well, do you really think the CIA is so dumb to tell the guy making the glove or the boot or the door handle, hey, we're really not going to the moon. Be sure not to tell anybody. That's like saying what a CEO of Wells Fargo Bank and the bank teller know about corruption in the bank are the same thing. It's completely different. The atomic bomb involved 145,000 people, and only 8 of them knew what they were building. So it's very easy, actually, to fake the moon landing. In fact, a guy in the command center of Houston Control said after the Apollo mission, he could tell no difference whatsoever between a simulation and an actual flight. It's just a bunch of numbers going by on a screen. And at the beginning of a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, which you can see for free at Sibrel.com. There's this tracking shot past Houston Control, seconds away from going to the moon for the very first time. And all the controllers are just kicked back watching television like everybody else. It's all for show. And if they admit they can't tell a difference between a simulation and an actual flight, I don't see how someone watching it in their living room as a 10-year-old could tell. And then thirdly, they say, well, Russia would have found out and China would have found out and blown the whistle. Well, that's half true. They would have eventually found out, and they did find out. But think about this, Michael. Let's say I have a picture of a world leader with a prostitute. I could upload it to the internet and take them down, and then the picture is worth nothing. Or the smart thing would be to blackmail them year after year after year with more money. Nixon said China and Russia are the biggest enemies, and then he goes over to China, kisses their butt, and sells grain to Russia below cost during the Apollo program. They definitely know. And we have an eyewitness who says they're being blackmailed by the Chinese government. So that's what a really good chess player would do on the international stage. They don't just blurt out secrets, they blackmail you with them. That's why they're keeping their mouth shut. And then just ask Saddam Hussein or Noriega or Gaddafi what happens when you don't cooperate with the United States of America. So just because India or Japan says, oh, we went, well, I wonder what would happen if they said they didn't.
Yeah, and what about the astronauts themselves? So you've approached over the years many astronauts. So can you talk about that along with Neil Armstrong specifically? You know, he allegedly is the first man on the moon. Did he talk about it a lot? You know, over the decades, what exactly was his approach of accomplishing such a monumental achievement?
Well, I postponed, declaring for sure that the moon missions were fake for the longest time possible, giving the benefit of the doubt until I see this footage, which is at Sibrel.com, of them faking being halfway to the moon right in front of your eyes. And I'm like, oh, well, there you go. So you would think that, I mean, that's what convinced me and convinces a lot of people when I sit in on a screening of the film and that part comes up and the lights come up and they see it's a 1-foot model of the Earth. There's gasps in the audience. But some people, about 20%, are convinced because of their expressions of the astronauts at their first press conference, where they look like they're at the funeral of their mother for an hour, just regretting saying what they're saying. And you would think these guys would give interviews. Well, 2 of the 3 people, Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins, only give interviews if the president of the United States personally asked them to do it. And on one such occasion, on the 25th anniversary, you can see the clip in my movie at Sibrel.com, Neil Armstrong is holding back tears as he's talking in the White House on the 25th anniversary of The Greatest Lie. High school students are touring through, and he says to them tearfully, perhaps someday you'll be able to remove one of truth's protective layers. He said his entire life that the following artifacts he left on the moon, and when he dies, his widow finds them in his closet. Well, that means the Earth is the moon and the moon is the Earth, meaning they never went to the moon because he claimed he left them on his moon, and they, were in his closet. So, and then they uncover a moon rock in Amsterdam. They open up this rock that's been hermetically sealed since 1969 that Neil Armstrong says he personally picked up off the moon's surface and personally gave it to the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. They seal it up. A curator watches my film, gets curious, opens it up in the middle of the night, puts it under a microscope, and finds out it's a piece of petrified wood. It makes the news. Moon rock proves to be fake, but no one asks the next question. Well, then what about the moon missions? I mean, they go up to the highest altitude, they see sparks of light from the Van Allen radiation belt, and the news reports the radiation belt is more dangerous than previously believed. Well, wait a minute. How can an orbital crew 650 miles below it know more about it than people who went through it, unless they didn't go through it? You see, so there's all these clues, and a space shuttle astronaut says, we hope someday to go to the moon. If they really went to the moon 6 times, then you certainly don't have to go a 7th time to practice to go to Mars. So the idea that they have to, go to the, if imagine we've been to the North Pole 6 times and the South Pole 0. It's like, well, we better go 7 times before we go to the South Pole. I mean, come on. It doesn't make any sense. You don't go from a bicycle back to a tricycle. So I think they blackmailed him. I think they threatened to kill his family. That's why he participated and didn't want to have any interviews. In fact, there's only like 15 pictures of an astronaut on the surface of the moon during Apollo 11, and there's 0 of him. I went to the walk-in vault at the NASA archives and said, show me a picture, most famous man on most famous mission, of NASA, Neil Armstrong standing on the moon. Show me a picture of that. They went in and out, scratched their heads, went in and out. I went in there myself. There isn't one. How about that? He didn't want to have his picture taken. And so he was on the visitors list. So when these TV images were being filmed, he wasn't even in the spacesuit. He probably didn't have the stamina to endure that heat for that long without the air conditioning unit removed, which they had to remove them. It would be too heavy in Earth's gravity. Some people believe, bodybuilder type people were in there. And he just merely observed it so that he could somehow relate to it during the press conference. So these guys are stuck. If only one person claimed to have walked on the moon, maybe they would have told the truth by now. But there's many other people he's inadvertently confessing for. So this is something you didn't tell your wife or your pastor or your children for their own protection. My source, Cyrus Eugene Akers, who I witnessed the faking of the moon landing, which I talk about in the book, audio, Kindle, or print at Sibrel.com, he told his son this information, and I confirmed this while I was editing my book. And shortly after doing that, this person was threatened face to face by government employees with death if he ever spoke to me again about his father's participation in the moon landing fraud. That was less than 2 years ago. So imagine the pressure of these people ruining the reputation of the other surviving astronauts, ruining the reputation of America, causing the collapse of the dollar, the stock market, probably, if the truth came out. They're just keeping their mouth shut to their grave and committing to the lie, as liars generally do.
So you've been talking about this for a long time. What have you faced directly?
After I found this classified footage, I was immediately followed late at night from church. They zapped my car, disabled my car. I've had my brakes tampered with, my cruise control tampered with, so the accelerator pedal got stuck. I've been drugged on at least 2 occasions, one that I know of when I was rushing to CNN to get this footage to a reporter, surrounded by government agents, confiscated the tape, threw me in a dark van, gave me a drug that I presume was truth serum, so strong I was vomiting. I remember the first question or 2 that they had prearranged on a clipboard. I told them everything they wanted to know and escaped their custody, made my way back to Nashville, and I said, I got him. I got truth serum in me, and so I peed in a cup and I gave it to a friend to put in a lab in his name. I said, I'm gonna show this to NBC. And a few days go by, I check with my friend, what's the status of the drug report. They said, well, there was a problem at the lab. And I'm like, oh, what problem? And they said, well, they had a break-in over the weekend. I said, yeah, what of it? He said, well, funny thing, the only thing stolen was your urine sample. And I'm like, the people at the lab were freaked out, and they're like, we don't know who you are, but take your business elsewhere. So I never generally talk about these things publicly, but seeing how the book is my final historic statement about the matter, and I hope to put it behind me and move on to feature filmmaking, I thought I'd tell the full story. And yeah, you have to understand that I think the guy's name was James Roche, was the chairman of General Motors, and he sicked FBI agents on Ralph Nader just to not have to put airbags in cars. And Jack Anderson, investigative journalist, was minutes away from having LSD put on his steering wheel to discredit him or kill him from exposing the Contra Aid conspiracy. And that's out of the mouth of G. Gordon Liddy said so. They're taking these. Pierre Salinger, press secretary for the Kennedy administration, went on national TV and he says, I'm 100% certain, I think it's Flight 800, correct me if I'm wrong, was brought down by a Navy missile by accident. He says, I staked my entire reputation as a reporter on it. Next day he says, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Something got to him there, didn't it? You see? And so I experienced the same thing. I mean, think about it. If they're sicking FBI agents on people just to not put airbags in cars, imagine what they would do to prevent America's most embarrassing fraud from coming to light.
Yeah, I think you've definitely given me, and I think everyone who's going to listen to this, a lot to think about. And it's fascinating, intriguing. So where can someone start? So Bart, if somebody wants to start digging in, figuring out, all right, what is with this guy, Bart? Is he making sense? Is he not making sense? And how do they corroborate everything that you've been saying? Where's a good place for them to start?
Yeah, my book is only a little over 200 pages. It's 20 years of investigation. It includes 16 interactive video links. I read the book on audio myself. It's also in Kindle or print. Just go to Sibrel.com. My last name, S as in Sam, I, B as in boy, REL, Sibrel.com. If you want to link to it, you can. And you can get 2 decades of research and experience, including 16 video clips to back up everything that I'm saying. And you'll likely come to the same conclusion I reluctantly did, that the federal government did, in fact, fake the moon landing and murder people to cover it up. And that's the sad government and world that we have.
It'll be interesting to see if this video is, stays up and for how long. So that also give us some indication.
I said certain things correctly because I think they scanned the audio. So I think I said things the right way to know, for people to know what I'm saying without saying certain words.
Yeah. Good old Big Brother's watching, huh?
Yeah,
and listening. Yeah. Well, I
mainly
appreciate
listening.
Yeah, and listening. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking time to chat. It's definitely been a lesson learned, I think, for me as well. As you start to hear from people from all walks of life that they've experienced something, whether it's their PayPal account being canceled, whether I have attorney friends that are just not in the politics, but they're somehow kicked off LinkedIn. Other people, regular businesses selling volleyball nets where they had their monies being seized because maybe they said the wrong thing. So when you start to hear these things from a lot of different people, all different walks of life, different locations, different careers and professions, there's a pattern. And the pattern seems to be
exactly what they did to the Jews before World War II. So we should be putting a stop to it 5 years ago, and we're just letting it go on and go on and go on.
It's fascinating to see what's happening in real time, where it's going, and what the solution will be. Well, hopefully that solution will come quicker than we think. So again, it was good chatting with you. Let's continue to stay in touch.
All right, Michael, take care.
All right, Bart, you as well. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, let's go. I don't care what they all say. That's right, I'ma do this thing my way. Let's go. Been grinding hard on it all day. Okay, we work hard, then we all play.